Right now, you're probably watching this on your phone, or maybe your laptop. Maybe you drove here in an electric car that you charged last night, feeling good about reducing your carbon footprint. Here's something nobody tells you when you buy these devices. When you unbox that sleek new phone or celebrate going electric, the battery that powers it, that lithium-ion battery that's become so essential to modern life that we panic when it drops below 20%, that battery has a story. And it's not the story the companies want you to know. That battery needs cobalt. Not wants it, needs it. Cobalt is what keeps lithium-ion batteries stable, what gives them energy density, what makes it possible for a battery small enough to fit in your pocket to power a device for an entire day. And here's where it gets dark. Over 70% of the world's cobalt comes from one place, the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the poorest, most war-torn countries on Earth. A country sitting on a fortune in minerals that should make it wealthy beyond measure. But instead, those minerals fund militias, enable child labor, and generate profits for some of the richest corporations in history, while the people digging them out of the ground can barely survive. This isn't ancient history. This is happening right now, today, so that we can scroll through social media and pretend we're saving the planet with our electric cars. If you want to understand how global supply chains hide suffering, how green technology can have blood on its hands, stick around. And if this is the kind of uncomfortable truth you think people need to hear, subscribing helps me keep digging into these stories. Let's talk about what's really inside your phone. Let's talk about blood batteries. Pull your phone out of your pocket for a second and really look at it. It's probably sleek, beautifully designed, weighs almost nothing, feels like a miracle of engineering. And it is. The amount of computing power in that device would have seemed like science fiction 30 years ago. But let's talk about what makes it possible, because there's one component that everything else depends on, one technology that's become so fundamental to modern life that civilization as we know it would basically stop functioning without it. The lithium-ion battery. It's in your phone, your laptop, your tablet, your wireless headphones, your electric toothbrush, your car if you've gone electric, in grid-scale energy storage systems that are supposed to solve climate change by storing renewable energy. By 2024, roughly 76% of all global cobalt demand is going into batteries, and that percentage keeps growing as we electrify transportation and try to build a renewable energy infrastructure. Electric vehicles alone consumed around 95,000 tons of cobalt in 2024, and that number is projected to multiply several times over by 2030 as EV adoption accelerates. But here's what makes this interesting from a materials perspective. You can't just make a lithium-ion battery out of lithium. The chemistry is more complex than that. You need specific metals in specific combinations to make batteries that are stable, that hold charge efficiently, that don't catch fire or degrade too quickly. And one of the most important of those metals, one that's incredibly difficult to replace with current technology, is cobalt. It stabilizes the battery's cathode, prevents overheating, extends the battery's lifespan. Engineers have been trying to reduce or eliminate cobalt from battery chemistries for years, and they've had some success with certain designs. But high-performance batteries for phones and electric vehicles still rely heavily on cobalt because nothing else quite matches its properties. So where does cobalt come from? This is where the story gets uncomfortable, because cobalt isn't like oil where it's found all over the world in various countries. cobalt is geographically concentrated in ways that create enormous power imbalances and moral dilemmas. The Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, holds over 50% of the world's known cobalt reserves and produces somewhere between 70 and 75% of the cobalt that enters global markets annually. No other country comes close. If you're holding a device with a lithium-ion battery, there's a very high probability that some of the cobalt in that battery came from Congo. Now, if you know anything about the DRC's history, you're probably already seeing where this is going. This is a country that's been devastated by colonialism, dictatorship, civil war, and ongoing conflict for over a century. It's one of the poorest countries on earth by almost any measure, despite sitting on mineral wealth that should theoretically make it incredibly prosperous. And the cobalt that powers our devices, that enables our transition to electric vehicles and renewable energy, that makes our modern technological lifestyle possible. That cobalt is mined in conditions that range from exploitative to absolutely horrific, often by people including children who see almost none of the massive profits the mineral generates once it enters global supply chains. So here's the question we're going to explore. How did our clean, modern technology, our smartphones that we use to advocate for social justice, our electric cars that we buy to fight climate change, how did all of this end up wired into one of the world's bloodiest ongoing conflicts? How did green technology become dependent on a supply chain that involves child labor, militia funding, and some of the worst working conditions in the extractive industries? And why, despite years of awareness and promises from tech companies to clean up their supply chains, does the system keep functioning exactly the same way? To answer those questions, we need to understand the DRC itself, its history with resource extraction, and why a country sitting on such enormous mineral wealth has remained so desperately poor. Because Congo's cobalt isn't a new story. It's the latest chapter in a resource curse that's been destroying that country for over a century. The Democratic Republic of Congo sits in Central Africa, a massive country roughly the size of Western Europe, with rainforests, rivers, mountains, and underneath all of that, some of the richest mineral deposits on Earth: copper, cobalt, diamonds, gold, coltan, tin, tungsten. If there's a mineral that modern industry needs, there's a good chance the DRC has significant amounts of it. This should be one of the wealthiest countries on the planet. Instead, it's consistently ranked among the poorest, with the majority of its population living on less than $2 a day, with infrastructure that's barely functional in many regions, with ongoing violence and instability that's killed millions over the past few decades. This paradox, enormous resource wealth combined with desperate poverty, is what economists call the resource curse. And the DRC might be the most extreme example of it in human history. To understand why, you need to understand how Congo's relationship with resource extraction was shaped from the very beginning by exploitation so brutal it shocked even other colonial powers, who weren't exactly squeamish about violence themselves. When European powers carved up Africa in the late 19th century, the territory that would become the DRC ended up as the personal property, not of Belgium as a country, but of Belgium's King Leopold II as his private possession. The Congo Free State, as it was called, was run essentially as a massive forced labor camp, extracting rubber and ivory for Leopold's personal profit. The violence and brutality of this system killed millions of Congolese people, through murder, starvation, disease, and mutilation. When international pressure finally forced Belgium to take over administration from Leopold directly in 1908, conditions improved marginally, but the fundamental relationship remained. Congo existed to provide raw materials for European industry, and Congolese people existed to extract those materials at minimal cost. Independence in 1960 should have changed this dynamic, but it didn't, partly because the Cold War superpowers had no interest in allowing genuine Congolese control over such strategically important minerals. The country descended into crisis almost immediately. Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected prime minister who wanted Congo to actually benefit from its own resources, was overthrown and assassinated with Western involvement within months of independence. Mobutu Sese Seko took power in a coup in 1965 and ran the country as a kleptocracy for over 30 years, stealing billions while the country's infrastructure collapsed and poverty deepened. Mobutu was supported by Western governments because he was anti-communist and because he kept the minerals flowing to global markets. When Mobutu finally fell in 1997, the country didn't find peace. It descended into what's sometimes called Africa's World War, a series of overlapping conflicts that drew in multiple neighboring countries and killed an estimated 5 million people between 1998 and 2003, making it the deadliest conflict since World War II. And crucially for our story, these wars were funded in large part by minerals. Armed groups discovered they could finance themselves by controlling mining areas and trade routes, taxing mineral extraction, and selling minerals to international buyers who either didn't know or didn't care about the source. The geography of cobalt in the DRC centers on a region called the Copper Belt, which extends from Katanga province in southern DRC across the border into Zambia. This is one of the richest mineral zones in the world, with enormous deposits of copper and cobalt that have been mined for over a century, but still contain reserves estimated at around 6 million tons of cobalt, about half of all known global reserves. The geology that created these deposits hundreds of millions of years ago essentially predetermined that whoever controlled this region would control a resource that the modern world desperately needs. But here's the cruel irony. The more valuable these minerals become, the more misery they seem to generate for the people living above them. High cobalt prices don't translate into prosperity for Congolese communities. They translate into more exploitation, more violence over control of mining areas, more incentive for armed groups to maintain their grip on these regions. The wealth flows out through export channels to refineries in China and other countries, then to battery manufacturers, then to tech and auto companies, and finally to consumers in wealthy countries who usually have no idea about any of this. The people doing the actual mining, working in conditions that kill and maim regularly, see almost none of those profits. And it's not just large-scale industrial mines we're talking about, though those exist and have their own problems. A huge portion of Congolese cobalt, maybe 20 to 30% of total production, comes from what's called artisanal and small-scale mining, a term that sounds almost quaint until you see what it actually means. We need to go into those mines to understand what artisanal cobalt mining really looks like, because that's where some of the worst abuses happen and where the connection to your phone becomes most direct and most disturbing. Eastern DRC, the provinces of North Kivu, South Kivu, and Ituri, has been a war zone for decades, with violence that never quite ends, that flares up and dies down and flares up again in ways that make it almost impossible for communities to ever find stability or safety. But this isn't random ethnic conflict or ancient tribal hatreds like Western media often portrays it. This is about resources, about control of mineral-rich territories, about armed groups that have discovered they can fund themselves indefinitely by controlling mines and trade routes. And cobalt, while not the only mineral in these conflicts, has become increasingly important as global demand has exploded. Here's how the system works in its most basic form. And understanding this helps explain why the violence persists despite peace agreements and international interventions. Armed groups, and we're talking about dozens of different militias, some with political agendas, some that are basically just criminal enterprises, some that started as community self-defense forces and evolved into predatory organizations. These groups control territory that includes mining areas or the routes minerals must travel to reach export points. They extract revenue from these minerals in multiple ways. Sometimes they directly control mines, forcing workers to dig and taking all or most of the profits. Sometimes they tax miners and traders, allowing extraction to continue, but demanding payment for protection or simply for permission to operate. Sometimes they hijack shipments being transported to cities or ports. The specific mechanisms vary, but the result is the same: minerals that should generate development and prosperity for Congolese communities instead fund violence and instability. And legitimate economic activity becomes impossible because anyone trying to operate honestly faces demands from armed groups who have the guns and the willingness to use them. Coltan, used in phone components, got significant attention in the 2000s as a conflict mineral. International pressure led to tracking and certification schemes designed to keep conflict minerals out of supply chains. But the reality is that these systems are porous and often ineffective. UN experts and investigative journalists repeatedly find that minerals from conflict areas are still entering global supply chains, sometimes with fraudulent certifications, sometimes laundered through neighboring countries like Rwanda or Uganda, where they're exported as if they originated there, sometimes just mixed in with legitimately sourced minerals at various points in the supply chain where tracking becomes impossible. In November 2025, the DRC government extended a ban on trade from 38 artisanal mining sites in North and South Kivu, specifically to cut off funding to armed groups. This sounds good in principle. If we can stop minerals from conflict zones from reaching markets, maybe we can starve the armed groups of revenue and force them to disarm. But in practice, these bans are incredibly difficult to enforce because the borders are long and porous, because corruption is endemic at every level, because traders have decades of experience in smuggling, and because international buyers often aren't particularly careful about verifying sources as long as prices are good and supply is steady. M23, one of the most powerful rebel groups currently operating in eastern DRC, exemplifies how armed groups operate in this environment. They control territory, they fight Congolese military forces and rival armed groups. They're accused by the DRC government and UN experts of being backed by Rwanda, and they generate revenue through minerals including cobalt. When M23 advances and takes control of mining areas, that doesn't mean mining stops. It means the profits from mining shift from whoever previously controlled the area to M23. The minerals keep flowing to global markets because there's too much money involved for the trade to stop. But now that money is funding a militia rather than even the limited legitimate governance that might have existed before. The human cost of this ongoing violence is staggering in ways that statistics can't really capture. Millions displaced from their homes by fighting, living in camps with inadequate food and water and sanitation. Sexual violence used systematically as a weapon of war, with women and girls targeted by armed groups and sometimes by soldiers who are supposed to protect them. Children growing up knowing nothing but war, recruited or coerced into armed groups as soldiers, porters, or sexual slaves. Communities that can't farm because fields are too dangerous, that can't send children to school because schools have been destroyed or are in conflict zones, that live in constant fear of the next attack or the next group of armed men arriving to take whatever little they have. And woven through all of this is the mineral trade, the cobalt and coltan and tin and tungsten and gold that make everything else possible, that provide the economic incentive for violence to continue. As long as these minerals are valuable, and as long as demand keeps growing, and remember, cobalt demand is growing rapidly as we electrify transportation and build renewable energy systems, there's an incentive for armed groups to maintain control over mining areas and trade routes. The green technology transition that's supposed to save the planet is inadvertently funding conflict in Central Africa, and most consumers have no idea this connection exists. But the violence and the militia funding are only part of the story. To really understand what artisanal cobalt mining means, to understand what it costs to get cobalt from underground into batteries, we need to go into the mines themselves and look at the conditions under which this work happens. And that's where the story gets even darker. When you hear the term artisanal mining, you might picture something almost romantic. Skilled craftspeople using traditional methods, small-scale operations that provide decent livelihoods for local communities. The reality of artisanal cobalt mining in the DRC is nothing like that. What artisanal actually means in this context is hand-dug pits and tunnels, often dozens of meters deep, excavated without engineering plans or safety equipment, prone to collapse, in areas where there's no regulation, no safety inspections, no workers' compensation if you're injured or killed, no environmental protection, no real oversight of any kind. Imagine a scene that's repeated across hundreds or thousands of locations in the cobalt-rich regions of the DRC. A clearing in the landscape where trees have been cut down and earth has been torn up, with openings in the ground where tunnels descend into darkness. Around these openings, men and boys, and it's mostly males doing the underground work. The women and girls work above ground, sorting and washing ore, are covered in reddish-brown dirt, using hand tools that haven't changed much in centuries. Picks, shovels, hammers, chisels, maybe some wheelbarrows for moving rock. That's it. That's the technology. The tunnels themselves are terrifying to anyone with even basic understanding of mine safety. They're narrow, barely wide enough for an adult to crawl through, with no reinforcement or shoring to prevent collapse. There's no ventilation system, so the air gets thin and contaminated with dust as you go deeper. There's no lighting except maybe flashlights or phone lights if someone has a charged phone. The ground is unstable because these aren't engineered excavations. They're holes dug by people following ore deposits wherever they lead, sometimes intersecting with other tunnels from other miners, sometimes undermining themselves without realizing it until a collapse happens. People die in these collapses regularly, not occasionally, regularly. Tunnels cave in, burying miners alive. And there's no rescue equipment, no trained rescue teams, just other miners trying to dig them out by hand before they suffocate or get crushed by shifting rocks. When someone dies, their body is removed if possible. The tunnel is maybe avoided for a while. And then people go back to work because there's no other source of income, no alternative employment, no safety net if you refuse to go underground. But it's not just the risk of collapse that makes this work deadly. Cobalt ore, when you're working with it in these uncontrolled conditions with no protective equipment, exposes workers to heavy metal contamination. Cobalt itself is toxic at high concentrations. You're breathing dust containing cobalt and other metals. You're absorbing it through your skin. If you're crushing or processing ore, which happens above ground in areas near the mines where women and children often work, you're generating more dust and more exposure. The health effects accumulate over time. Respiratory problems, skin rashes, neurological issues, reproductive problems, cancer risks that won't manifest for years but are significantly elevated. And then there are the children. This is where the story becomes almost unbearable because we're not talking about teenagers doing occasional work after school. We're talking about children as young as 6 or 7 working full days in these mines, either underground in the tunnels or above ground breaking rocks and sorting ore. The U.S. Department of Labor estimated around 25,000 children working in cobalt mines in the DRC. And that's probably an underestimate because these operations are informal and hidden, and nobody's doing systematic surveys to count children in remote mining areas. Why are children doing this work? The simplest answer is poverty so extreme that families have no other options for survival. If your family needs money to eat, if there's no school accessible, or if school costs money your family doesn't have, if there are no other jobs in your community, then sending children to work in mines becomes an economic necessity rather than a choice. Miners are usually paid by the amount of ore they extract, and children are cheaper to employ than adults, more compliant, easier to exploit. So mine operators and middlemen prefer child labor because it's more profitable. Research has documented how children in cobalt-rich areas have measurably worse educational outcomes, lower school enrollment, higher dropout rates, which makes sense when schools either don't exist or when families need children working instead of studying. The long-term effects are devastating because children who spend their developmental years breathing toxic dust in unstable mines instead of getting education have almost no path to escaping poverty. They're trapped in a cycle where the mineral wealth beneath their feet keeps them desperately poor while enriching everyone else in the supply chain. Siddharth Kara, who spent years researching and documenting conditions in Congolese cobalt mines, describes a system where around 75% of the world's cobalt is mined in the DRC, and where the suffering of miners is directly linked to the enormous profits that cobalt generates for global tech companies. The people at the bottom of this supply chain, the ones actually digging the cobalt out of the ground at enormous personal cost, might make $1 or $2 per day if they're lucky. The cobalt they extract might go through several hands before it even leaves the DRC, with each middleman taking a cut. By the time that cobalt ends up in a battery in a $1,000 smartphone or a $50,000 electric car, the value has multiplied thousands of times, and almost none of that value flows back to the communities and workers who extracted it. This is the reality behind artisanal mining. This is what makes your phone battery possible. And here's the thing that makes it even more complex and even more disturbing. Most of this cobalt does eventually make it into products from major brands that you know and trust, companies that have sustainability reports and human rights policies and public commitments to ethical supply chains. So how does cobalt mined in these conditions end up in products from Apple and Samsung and Tesla? To answer that, we need to follow the supply chain from these pits in the DRC to the device in your hand. The journey of cobalt from an artisanal mine in the DRC to your phone isn't a simple straight line. It's a deliberately opaque system with multiple intermediaries and processing stages that make it almost impossible to trace any specific piece of cobalt back to its source. This opacity isn't accidental. It exists because it's profitable, because it provides plausible deniability for companies that don't want to know too much about where their materials come from, and because as long as the system remains complex and murky, responsibility can be diffused across so many actors that no one entity can be held fully accountable. Let's walk through the typical journey, understanding that there are variations, but the basic structure is similar across most of the supply chain. It starts with extraction. A miner in an artisanal site digs ore containing cobalt, loads it into sacks or containers, and carries it to the surface. That ore gets sold, usually to local traders or buying houses that operate in or near mining areas. These are the first intermediaries, the people who aggregate ore from individual miners or small groups and collect enough volume to make larger sales worthwhile. These local traders sell to larger trading companies, some of them Congolese, some international, that handle export logistics. The ore at this stage might be raw or might have gone through some initial processing to concentrate the cobalt content. These trading companies move the cobalt out of the DRC, often through neighboring countries, and sell it to refineries and smelters that turn raw cobalt ore into refined cobalt chemicals suitable for battery production. This is where geography becomes crucial because the vast majority of cobalt refining capacity is in China, which processes somewhere around 70% of the world's cobalt. So Congolese cobalt very likely passes through Chinese refineries before it goes anywhere else. The refined cobalt gets sold to battery component manufacturers who produce the cathodes that go into lithium-ion batteries. These manufacturers sell to battery cell producers who assemble complete battery cells. Those cells get sold to companies that assemble battery packs for specific applications: phone batteries, laptop batteries, EV battery packs. And finally, those battery packs go to the brands we all know: Apple, Samsung, Tesla, Dell, Microsoft, who integrate them into finished products that get sold to consumers. At every stage of this chain, ownership and paperwork change hands. Material from different sources gets mixed together at refineries and manufacturing facilities. Traceability becomes almost impossible because cobalt from multiple mines and traders and countries all flows into the same processing facilities and emerges as generic refined cobalt or battery components with no clear connection to any specific source. This mixing is sometimes deliberate and sometimes just a practical result of how industrial processing works. But either way, it makes verification extremely difficult. NGOs and investigative organizations have been documenting for years that there is currently no way to guarantee that lithium-ion battery products are free from child labor and forced labor. The supply chains are too complex, too opaque, with too many intermediaries, and too much incentive for everyone to avoid asking uncomfortable questions. Companies at the end of the chain, the brands selling products to consumers, can say they require their suppliers to follow ethical standards, and they genuinely might have policies and contracts that mandate this. But enforcing those requirements through multiple layers of subcontractors across different countries with different regulatory environments is nearly impossible, especially when suppliers have strong incentives to hide problems rather than report them. This has led to legal battles that illustrate both the scope of the problem and the difficulty of assigning responsibility. In 2019, a lawsuit was filed accusing major tech companies, Apple, Google, Tesla, Microsoft, Dell, of benefiting from child labor in Congolese cobalt mines. The lawsuit was brought by Congolese families whose children had been killed or seriously injured in mine collapses, arguing that these companies knew or should have known that their supply chains involved child labor and dangerous conditions, but continued sourcing cobalt anyway because it was profitable. The companies defended themselves by arguing that they don't directly control artisanal mines, that they source from suppliers who are supposed to follow ethical standards, that they're working to improve supply chain transparency, but that the complexity of the system makes perfect oversight impossible. U.S. courts ultimately refused to hold these companies liable, dismissing the case on technical grounds about where jurisdiction properly lies. But the legal outcome doesn't change the underlying reality that was documented in the case. Congolese cobalt, mined in terrible conditions, does end up in products from major tech brands, and the current system doesn't effectively prevent this. As recently as November 2025, new lawsuits emerged targeting Apple, specifically over alleged conflict minerals from the DRC and Rwanda, including cobalt, tin, tantalum, and tungsten. These cases keep happening because the underlying problems haven't been solved. Companies issue statements about taking supply chain ethics seriously. They join industry initiatives to promote responsible sourcing. They publish sustainability reports describing their efforts. But the cobalt still comes from the same places, mined under similar conditions, because demand is so high and supply so geographically concentrated that companies either accept Congolese cobalt with all its problems, or they can't get enough cobalt to meet their production needs. There's a fundamental tension here that nobody wants to acknowledge directly. We want cheap, powerful batteries for our devices and vehicles. We want companies to keep costs down so products remain affordable. We want the convenience of technology that just works without having to think too hard about where it comes from. But we also want ethical supply chains, humane working conditions, environmental sustainability. And in the current system, those goals are in direct conflict. Making supply chains genuinely ethical and transparent would increase costs, reduce supply, slow down production. So companies make symbolic gestures and incremental improvements while the fundamental system remains unchanged. And that brings us to the current moment, where the tension between these competing demands is intensifying because of the green energy transition and the explosive growth in demand for batteries. There's profound irony in the fact that one of our most promising strategies for addressing climate change, electrifying transportation, and building renewable energy infrastructure with battery storage, is creating massive new demand for a mineral extracted under conditions that are environmentally destructive, socially harmful, and geographically concentrated in one of the world's most unstable regions. The green technology revolution is real and necessary, but it's being built on foundations that are anything but green when you look at the full picture. Electric vehicles are transforming automotive markets faster than most experts predicted even a few years ago. Countries are setting deadlines for phasing out internal combustion engines. Major automakers are committing billions to EV development and battery production. Consumers are increasingly willing to consider EVs as their next vehicle purchase. This is exactly what climate advocates have been pushing for, because transportation is a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions, and electrification offers a path to dramatically reduce those emissions, especially as electricity grids shift toward renewable sources. But every electric vehicle needs a battery pack, and that battery pack needs cobalt. By 2022, approximately 30% of global cobalt demand was already going to EV batteries, and that percentage keeps climbing. The Cobalt Institute's 2024 market report shows that cobalt demand passed 200,000 tons, with 76% used in batteries and EVs alone, consuming around 95,000 tons. Projections suggest this could multiply several times over by 2030 if current EV adoption trends continue, though the exact numbers depend on how quickly battery chemistry evolves to use less cobalt per battery. Energy storage systems for renewable energy create additional demand. Solar and wind power are intermittent. They generate electricity when the sun is shining or wind is blowing, not necessarily when consumers need it. Battery storage systems let you capture that energy and release it when needed, which is crucial for building grids that can run primarily on renewables. But those battery systems need cobalt too, adding yet another source of demand that's growing as renewable energy deployment accelerates. So we're in this situation where the technologies we're deploying to address one global crisis, climate change, are intensifying another crisis, resource extraction in conflict zones with terrible human rights conditions. And the people making decisions about climate policy and energy transition often seem either unaware of this connection or willing to treat it as an unfortunate but acceptable trade-off. After all, the reasoning goes, climate change threatens the entire planet. So if we have to accept some human rights problems in Congolese cobalt mines to enable the transition to clean energy, that's regrettable but necessary. But that framing ignores the fact that these aren't actually inevitable trade-offs. Battery chemistries exist that use less cobalt or no cobalt at all. Lithium-ion phosphate batteries, or LFP, have become increasingly popular, especially in cheaper electric vehicles and in stationary storage applications. They don't have quite the energy density of cobalt-rich batteries, which means they're heavier and bulkier for the same amount of energy storage. But for many applications, that's an acceptable trade-off. China has led in LFP adoption, and Tesla and other manufacturers have started using LFP batteries in some models. This shows that reducing cobalt dependence is technically possible, though it requires accepting some performance compromises. The problem is that for high-performance applications, luxury electric vehicles, phones, and laptops, where every millimeter of thickness matters, applications where weight is critical, cobalt-rich batteries still have significant advantages. Companies could choose to accept the performance trade-offs and eliminate cobalt from their supply chains, but they calculate that consumers won't accept those trade-offs, that buyers want the longest range and fastest charging and thinnest devices. and that market pressures make it impossible to unilaterally adopt more ethical but less performant technologies while competitors continue using cobalt. Meanwhile, cobalt prices have been volatile, rising dramatically during supply crunches and falling when recession fears reduce demand projections. The DRC government has experimented with various policies trying to capture more value from cobalt exports and improve conditions. In some cases, they've banned exports from specific artisanal sites. They've imposed quotas to try to regulate production. They've pushed for more local processing so that refined cobalt rather than raw ore gets exported, keeping more value-added production within the country. Some of these policies have good intentions, but enforcement is inconsistent and corruption undermines implementation. We're left with this bizarre situation where everyone involved, from mining companies to tech giants to consumers, understands at some level that the system is broken and harmful, but the economic incentives are so powerful and the coordination problems so difficult that the system continues largely unchanged. Tech companies make pledges about supply chain ethics while continuing to buy cobalt from the same sources. Consumers express concern about conflict minerals while continuing to buy new phones every couple of years and celebrate their electric vehicles. Governments pass regulations about responsible sourcing that have limited enforcement mechanisms and are easy to circumvent through falsified documentation. Is there any path out of this? Are there reforms, technologies, or policies that could actually make a difference rather than just serving as fig leaves for business as usual? That's what we need to explore next, because while the situation is grim, there are people and organizations trying to create alternatives, even if the scale of their efforts doesn't yet match the scale of the problem. The question of whether we can actually clean up cobalt supply chains and create something that approaches ethical sourcing isn't just academic. It's fundamental to whether the green technology transition can claim any moral legitimacy or whether it's just shifting environmental and human costs from wealthy countries to poor ones. And the honest answer is complex, because there are genuine efforts being made and some progress in certain areas, but also fundamental structural problems that aren't being addressed. Let's start with what's being tried on the ground in the DRC itself. In November 2025, an initiative called the EGC, Enterprise Générale du Cobalt, announced its first 1,000 tons of traceable artisanal cobalt, attempting to create a system where cobalt from artisanal mines can be tracked and certified as having been produced under dignified working conditions without child labor. The idea is to formalize artisanal mining, provide training and equipment to improve safety, eliminate child labor through monitoring and enforcement, and then certify this cobalt as responsibly sourced so it can command premium prices in international markets. If this works at scale, it could transform the economics of artisanal mining by showing that ethical production is viable and by creating market incentives for better practices. Miners would earn more from certified cobalt, which would reduce the economic pressure to use child labor or accept dangerous conditions. International buyers who genuinely want to source ethically would have a verified source to purchase from. It's a model that addresses both the supply-side problems in mining communities and the demand-side concerns of companies trying to clean up their supply chains. But there are huge challenges to scaling this model. You need verification systems that can't be easily corrupted, which is difficult in regions where governance is weak and bribery is endemic. You need enough mining operations willing to participate and submit to oversight, which means the economic incentives have to be strong enough to overcome resistance from people profiting from the current system. You need international buyers willing to pay premium prices for certified cobalt, rather than just purchasing the cheapest available supply, which requires either genuine ethical commitment or consumer pressure strong enough to change corporate behavior. At the regulatory level, there have been attempts to mandate responsible sourcing through law. The European Union has conflict minerals regulations targeting tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold, the minerals that got the most attention during the peak of conflict in the early 2000s. These regulations require companies importing these minerals into the EU to conduct due diligence on their supply chains and avoid sourcing from conflict zones. But investigative reporting and NGO monitoring consistently find that enforcement is weak, that minerals from conflict areas still enter European markets with fraudulent documentation, that the regulations create paperwork burdens without necessarily changing underlying practices. Expanding these regulations to cover cobalt and strengthening enforcement mechanisms could help, but only if there's political will to actually implement them rigorously, rather than just creating the appearance of action. And there's resistance from industry because stronger regulations might increase costs or reduce available supply. And from some developing country governments that see these measures as wealthy nations imposing barriers to their exports, while continuing to consume the minerals regardless of source. NGOs like Goodweave have launched initiatives specifically targeting child labor in cobalt mining, working with mining communities to remove children from mines and provide alternatives like education and family economic support. These projects are valuable and make real differences in individual communities, but the scale is tiny relative to the overall problem. Tens of thousands of children working in cobalt mines, and maybe a few hundred or a few thousand getting help from NGO programs. The math doesn't work unless these efforts can somehow scale up by orders of magnitude, which requires funding and organizational capacity that currently doesn't exist. From the technology side, the push toward cobalt-free or low-cobalt battery chemistries is probably the most promising long-term solution because it addresses the problem by reducing demand rather than trying to fix supply chains. If batteries don't need cobalt, then the conditions in Congolese cobalt mines become less relevant to consumer technology and transportation. LFP batteries, as mentioned earlier, are already deployed at significant scale and proving that many applications don't actually require cobalt-rich chemistries. Research into sodium-ion batteries, solid-state batteries, and other alternative technologies might eventually provide options that eliminate cobalt entirely while matching or exceeding current performance. But this transition takes time, requires massive investment in new manufacturing capacity, and faces resistance because existing battery factories represent huge sunk costs that companies want to recoup before switching to new chemistries. And even if the transition accelerates, there will still be a period of years or decades where we're producing millions of devices and vehicles with cobalt batteries, which means the supply chain problems remain urgent even as we work toward technical alternatives. The role of consumers in all of this is complicated because individual purchasing decisions have minimal impact on massive global supply chains, but collective pressure can sometimes shift corporate behavior. If enough people demanded cobalt-free devices or ethically sourced batteries and were willing to accept the costs and performance trade-offs that might entail, companies would have to respond. But organizing that kind of collective action is difficult, especially when the problems are hidden and technical and far away. When companies can make vague commitments about sustainability without much accountability, and when the immediate convenience and cost of devices override abstract ethical concerns for most buyers. What becomes clear looking at all these reform efforts is that no single approach is sufficient. We probably need all of them simultaneously. Better regulation with actual enforcement, technological shifts toward alternative battery chemistries, formalization and improvement of artisanal mining conditions, corporate transparency and accountability, consumer pressure, international cooperation, support for conflict resolution and governance improvement in the DRC itself. And even then, fixing decades of exploitation and conflict isn't quick or easy. The uncomfortable truth is that we've built our modern technological society on a foundation that includes child labor and conflict minerals and environmental destruction in places most people never see and never think about. We've outsourced the ugly parts of our supply chains to the poorest and most vulnerable communities on Earth. And then we've built systems deliberately designed to hide those connections, so consumers can enjoy their devices without confronting what made them possible. Cleaning that up isn't just a technical problem. It's a moral and political challenge that requires actually caring enough to accept costs and inconveniences and performance compromises in service of human rights and environmental protection for people who can't advocate for themselves. Pick up your phone again. Feel the weight of it. That weight isn't just glass and metal and silicon. It's also the weight of every decision and every compromise that brought it into existence. It's the weight of a Congolese child carrying rocks out of a tunnel that could collapse at any moment. It's the weight of militias funded by mineral sales. It's the weight of a development model that extracts wealth from the poorest places on Earth and concentrates it in the wealthiest. That weight is real, even if we usually choose not to feel it. This isn't a story about good guys and bad guys, because the system is more complicated than that. The tech companies buying cobalt aren't cartoonishly evil villains rubbing their hands together while children suffer. They're responding to market pressures and consumer demands in ways that make business sense, even if they create terrible human costs. The traders and middlemen in the supply chain are often just people trying to make a living in difficult environments with limited options. Even some of the armed groups started as community self-defense forces before evolving into predatory organizations. And consumers buying phones and electric cars aren't monsters. They're mostly just living their lives, using technologies that have become essential, unaware of or overwhelmed by the complexity of where these things come from. But systems built by human choices can be changed by human choices, and hiding behind complexity or inevitability is ultimately just an excuse for accepting what we should be fighting to change. The current cobalt supply chain isn't a natural disaster or an unfortunate accident. It's the result of specific decisions by governments and corporations and consumers. Decisions made because they're profitable or convenient, or because changing them seems too difficult. And if those decisions created this system, different decisions could create a different system. What would that different system look like? Maybe it's a world where we've successfully transitioned to battery chemistries that don't require cobalt, where technological innovation has eliminated the problem by eliminating the demand. Maybe it's a world where the DRC has achieved enough stability and governance capacity that mining happens under genuinely ethical conditions with proper safety standards and fair compensation. Maybe it's a world where international regulations actually work, where supply chains are transparent and verifiable, where companies face real consequences for sourcing from child labor or conflict zones. Maybe it's a world where consumers value ethics enough that they're willing to accept less impressive devices or higher prices in exchange for cleaner supply chains. Probably it's some combination of all of these, because no single solution fixes everything. But getting to any version of that better world requires first acknowledging what the current world actually looks like, requires being honest about the costs our technologies impose on people. We'll never meet in places we'll probably never go. It requires being uncomfortable, staying uncomfortable, and using that discomfort as motivation to demand better rather than just finding ways to stop thinking about it. The cobalt in your phone connects you to a child in the DRC, whether you want that connection or not, whether you acknowledge it or not. That connection is real. The question is what you do with that knowledge. You can forget about it, go back to scrolling, let the system continue as it is, because changing it seems impossible, or because your individual action feels too small to matter. That's what most people do. And it's understandable because we're all overwhelmed by the enormous problems in the world and the limited capacity any individual has to address them. Or you can let it change something. You can start asking questions about where your devices come from and whether companies are doing enough to clean up their supply chains. You can support policies and regulations that mandate transparency and ethical sourcing, even if they increase costs. You can consider keeping devices longer instead of upgrading constantly. You can support the organizations actually working on the ground to improve conditions for miners and get children out of mines. You can use your purchasing decisions and your voice and your vote in ways that say, this isn't acceptable, that green technology built on blood isn't actually green, that we need to find better ways. None of this is simple, and none of it offers the satisfaction of a clean, easy solution. The complexity is real. The trade-offs are genuine. But complexity and difficulty aren't excuses for inaction. They're reasons to think harder and work smarter and refuse to accept that the current system is the best we can do. The battery in your device holds a charge. It also holds a story about resource extraction and global inequality and the real costs of our technological lives. You know that story now. You can't unknow it. The only question is what you do next, how you let that knowledge shape your choices and your demands and your understanding of what it really means to build a sustainable future. If this uncomfortable truth made you think differently about the device in your hand, if it connected dots you hadn't connected before, I'd appreciate if you subscribed, because there are more of these stories, more hidden systems, more uncomfortable truths, more moments where the convenience of our lives depends on suffering we've been taught not to see. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being willing to sit with discomfort instead of looking away. See you in the next one.